We're joined today by Suzanne Kahn, who is a recent PhD from Columbia with an expertise and a dissertation on women's history in the 1970s. And she and Nick are going to help us understand something of how change was institutionalized in the 1970s. Tell us something about how members of Congress anticipated the ERA's success and or failure.
So when the ERA is introduced, there is a lot of debate, and that debate continues throughout the entire time that it is being ratified or not ratified by the states, about what it will actually mean. What would it mean to have the ERA pass? And one thing that I think is sort of commonly agreed on is that it will require the federal code, so all the laws, federal laws, to no longer treat men and women differently. And even within that, there's debate about what that would mean. But pretty quickly, so by the late 1970s, you have women members of Congress actually putting together a package of legislation, an omnibus bill, that seeks to specifically go through and pass new laws that don't treat men and women differently in all the places where men and women were currently treated differently.
Can you describe this omnibus bill? This is the bill that becomes the Economic Equity Act?
Exactly, yes. So it is so an omnibus bill is a very a large package of legislation. All the pieces of it can be passed separately, or it could be passed all at once. And in the different pieces of it all approach different economic laws that treat men and women differently. So, for example, the Economic Equity Act looks at retirement pensions, and one thing that was different about retirement pensions and the way women were covered by them was that because women lived longer, it cost more to sort of cover for their employers to cover them if they wanted to pay for a retirement pension or life insurance. And so women were generally discriminated against and had to pay much more for those products. And the bill said, no, you can't do that. If women and men may, on average, live different lengths of time, but this is clearly sexist. Another example would be healthcare, where women almost always had to pay more for healthcare than men, and the justification was that women got pregnant, men didn't. That was more costly. Women had more health problems. And again, the bill said this would be discrimination. So there's a whole package of laws like that looked at all sorts of things, whether it was the tax code, which we've talked about, or I'm sure you've talked about in earlier classes, Social Security, private pensions, credit. All of those things were going to be directly addressed by this act, the Economic Equity Act, that was originally conceived of as enabling legislation that would make the ERA's intention a reality.
So did the act actually pass?
Well, different pieces of it do, and then it changes over time. So they pass, for example, a law about how pension, that includes, it's called the Retirement Equity Act of 1984, that starts to change how retirement pensions are divided between men and women, how women, that accounts for women's different life patterns and in how retirement pensions treat men and women, but they don't pass other pieces of it, and it never passes as a whole omnibus piece of legislation.
But you're saying that one response to the defeat of the ERA, people let it go in 1982 when it expires, is that the effects of the ERA are somehow covered by this package of laws, which doesn't get passed as a package, but which gets passed in pieces.
Yeah, I don't think I'm saying that the ERA is sufficiently replaced by the Economic Equity Act, but it's a useful place to look when we think about what happened to the feminist agenda after the ERA dies. So the existence of the Economic Equity Act before the ERA dies, they continue to fight for that, but now they have to go piece by piece instead of the hope had always been the ERA would pass, and then in reaction to that, this whole omnibus piece of legislation would pass at once.
So I want to go back a step and ask a little bit about who the actors are in this. Who is there in Congress who's pushing the ERA, who's pushing the Economic Equity Act or its pieces?
Well, there are the characters shift a lot from the early 1970s to the beginning of the 1980s. Early in the 1970s, there are a number of very big women congresswomen figures with big personalities. Bella Abzug is a classic example, a congresswoman from New York, and a very loud feminist, a big supporter of the National Organization for Women and the ERA. And there are other women in Congress who are part of sort of that contingent. Another example is Pat Schroeder, who arrives in 1974. She's the first young mother in Congress, so she has kids in diapers when she gets to Congress, and there's a lot of conversation about how is she going to manage it all, and she's very funny, so she has lots of funny responses to it. And so there are these are the women who are pushing for the ERA early on. There are also a number of African American women in Congress in the early 1970s, including Yvonne Brathwaite Burke from California, Barbara Jordan from Texas. And they work together, but there's not a formal organization that are part of. By the late 1970s, some of those big personalities like Bella Abzug are no longer in Congress, and women in Congress actually across party lines form the Congressional Caucus on Women's Issues. And there you have Pat Schroeder taking the lead, Elizabeth Holtzman taking the lead, as well as Republicans like Olympia Snowe, who, if you've been paying attention to politics in the last 10 years, is still a figure who's around. And that Congressional Caucus on Women's Issues supports the ERA, but also really puts their weight behind the Economic Equity Act. And so the Economic Equity Act is also interesting because it's a bipartisan bill.
So the legislative changes come from recently elected, mostly Congresswomen, I assume. But are there other demands for changes that come from women outside Congress? Nick, can you speak to that?
And before he does, I just want to jump in and say, I think that the women in Congress who are pushing this legislative change are really responding to a grassroots activists, both because they come from the movement in many cases, but also because women really turn to them and send them letters and with detailed legislative proposals in a really interesting way, and are driving, I think, a lot of what ends up in the Economic Equity Act. And one thing that's interesting about that is the women who send these congresswomen letters are not just from their districts. We tend to think that when you send a congressperson a letter, it's to the person who represents you. And that's not what happens. It's women across the country are reaching out to the congresswomen who are famous for caring about feminist issues.
This is really interesting because we've been talking about the way in which feminist demands of all kinds actually expand democracy. And here's an illustration of that kind of expanse. Now that we see women in Congress, we see ordinary women writing to them and asking for things that they might never have had access to before.
Exactly.
And as Suzanne said, I think it's important to remember that many of these women congressmen are coming right out of the movement. Shirley Chisholm of Brooklyn is a great example. She is elected over in the Democratic primary a much better known civil rights activist nationally, James Farmer. But her success comes in large part because she has been a grassroots activist in Brooklyn among many women who are active in new war on poverty roles and movements. And so she's very much attached to that world of activism and attuned to the needs of women who themselves are working both as activists and as sort of what we'd call human service workers in a series of new kinds of positions.
That's fascinating. And Bella Abzug, of course, also comes out of Women's Strike for Peace, the peace movement more generally. And when she loses that battle for the Senate in 1976, she goes back to the movement, if you want to call it that.